I go to Cooperstown for the 19th Century Baseball conference that I presented at last year, actually. And I took a couple of the guys aside. David Nemec, who's a great researcher, has written a number of books, and I said, David, I keep running into this thing while I'm researching Detroit about all these players from Detroit are coming down with malaria. Do you have any idea what that's all about? And he says, no, I didn't really run into that very much. So then a little bit later, John Thorne, who is the Major League Baseball historian and who's written extensively, and he's like, he's like Moses for baseball. He's awesome. And I said to him, John, I keep running into this thing and these players that are coming down with malaria. I had barely got the word malaria out of my mouth, and he says, it's the clap. Baseball players were very popular with the ladies, and they would travel extensively, and they would come down with social diseases, it turns out. And this was one of the things that the managers of the day had to deal with when their players were indisposed. I still don't know, however, how going to a spa and baths for a couple of weeks would cure you of a sexually transmitted disease, but apparently that's what they were doing.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, what's new? How's it going? My name's Tim Hanlon, that is. And you've come across my little podcast. It's called Good Seats Still Available. And it is, of course, devoted to what used to be in professional sports. And I thank you so much for finding us and downloading us and giving us a listen. And if you've come back from a previous listen, I especially and doubly and super duper appreciate it as well. Today we are honoring the fact that pitchers and catchers have been spotted in their respective training camps in Florida and Arizona. And it's a good opportunity, good excuse to start thinking about baseball once again. And baseball has a rich and varied history. Sometimes we're going to go back to things that are a little bit more recent, but we're also going to go back to things that frankly, are not so recent and a bit more historical in presence. But again, as with everything that we discuss here on this little show, it all adds up to rich and interesting stories, and a lot of which today's sort of modern sports successes are built upon. And today we are joined by our guest, Chip Martin, who has a really cool little book about a team that basically was the first professional baseball club to play in the city of Detroit. Most people think that the Tigers were the sort of originators of pro baseball in the Motor City. And of course, that is not true, as our guest Chip Martin will tell us. And the team, of course, or maybe not known to most, was called the Detroit Wolverines. And in 1881, May 2nd of 1881 for that matter, the first ever Major League Baseball game in Detroit was played. And it was these Detroit Wolverines playing the team from Buffalo. And there's a plaque still there where the old recreation park used to stand. And it's a very interesting conversation and story. You're going to find some very fun and somewhat ribald stories in the telling of the Wolverines' history. You have some very interesting characters for sure. And certainly, as we've talked about with our friend Bill Rysick on the predecessor to the National League, the National Association, roguishness was certainly very common at that time. Baseball players certainly enjoyed their lifestyle, shall we say, and we'll hear a few more interesting anecdotes as to what we mean by that, especially when it comes to this Detroit team. Nicknames, crazy nicknames of all kinds, some of them not necessarily the most flattering. And yes, for you Pretzels Getzon fans out there, we will be talking about the legendary curveball thrower that was on the Detroit Wolverines and probably had the best name on the team, nickname-wise, that being Pretzels Getzon. An interesting story there, among many others, with our guest, Chip Martin, and a discussion about the Detroit Wolverines of the National League of the late 1800s, coming up in just a couple of seconds. Let us see. We are again sponsored by our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And again, you've got to go to sportshistorycollectibles.com. That is the place to find all of your treasure troves of sports memorabilia, whether that be buttons or pennants and programs and media guides and baseball and other trading cards. And it's a rich tapestry of stuff that you're going to lose a lot of time and a lot of minutes on the site just gazing But hopefully you'll also be convinced that some of those items that you'll find on sportshistorycollectibles.com will be worth owning for yourself. And should you make that determination, of course, we want to help. And of course, by using the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout, we will help by giving you 15% off your purchases. So no better excuse to give the site and a couple of shekels to sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use that promo code GOODSEATS. Save yourself 15% off of your purchases, and you'll enjoy the experience as well. And we love the idea of sportshistorycollectibles.com. We love our friend Dean Mitchell for introducing us to it, and what a kindred soul he and that site is to whatever ridiculousness that we're pursuing here on this little podcast. And we encourage you to visit early and visit often. sportshistorycollectibles.com. Don't forget that promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. And of course, we also want to remind you about Audible, our friends in the world of audiobooks. And there's so many cool things, so many great stories to be heard and listened to. Sometimes you just don't feel like reading. You're biking or you're doing some other kind of activity, and your eyes are busy doing something other than paying attention, but your ears are open and receptive to listening to a good story. And why not try Audible for yourself? Get your free audiobook download and a free month of the Audible audiobook service. And the best way, of course, to do that is by going to audibletrial.com/goodseats and giving yourself and itself, or whatever, a try. Please do. As you know, we got a couple of shekels for you giving it a try, and we certainly love to help keep this podcast growing. And we could always use a little bit of a financial love once in a while to sort of keep things on the up and up. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, a free audiobook to enjoy, a free 1-month subscription to the service, and important fact, you can cancel at any time. It's really a no-risk proposition. And as we've said many times before, the library is vast. It's 180,000 and counting titles to choose from, and you will absolutely find something, I guarantee you, that will be of interest to burn your free download audiobook credit. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thank you for trying that out. Thank you, Audible, for being a sponsor, and we appreciate it. All right, so let us get into the sport of baseball circa the late 1880s or so. And we're going to go to the Motor City. It wasn't the Motor City at that time just yet, but the team is called the Detroit Wolverines, and a very crazy cast of characters and some interesting stories about that team with our guest, Chip Martin. Please enjoy.
Well, I'm a retired newspaper reporter, so I know how to write a bit. After 41 years, I think I got the hang of it. I've been a long-time baseball fan. I played for, actually fastball. I played for my soft pitch for my town when I was growing up. And in Canada, where I live, in London, Ontario, a lot of early baseball was played up here. In fact, here in London, we have the world's oldest baseball park, Labatt Park, and the first recorded game of baseball occurred in about 40 minutes away from my home here in a little place called Beachville, and that was in 1838. So with all that, and being a baseball fan, I like hockey, but I really like baseball. And I saw Ken Burns' documentary back in the early 1990s about baseball. And I have to be honest, I was a little offended when toward the end of his series he said, and now baseball is truly international, that the Blue Jays have won the World Series. We've been playing baseball since the earliest of days here. Small towns in Ontario, and this part of the world anyway, may not have enough money or may not be big enough to have a hockey arena, but there's ball diamonds everywhere. And baseball has been a part of our fabric, of our culture, almost as long as yours. And I got motivated when I heard Ken Burns talking about that, and I said, well, that's not right. I know we've been playing baseball here a long time. So I wrote my first baseball book called Baseball's Creation Myth, which reminded people that the story about baseball being invented in Cooperstown is a myth, and I suggested for the first time that perhaps the story was borrowed and adapted from the story of the first recorded game in Beachville in Ontario, which would be interesting because the idea of having baseball invented in Cooperstown was to prove that it was purely an American invention. Well, the reality is it wasn't invented at all, and it sort of evolved over the years, and it evolved in different places in different ways. And we were sort of in on the ground floor. So I wrote that book. And then I said, well, I should do something about the London Tecumsehs of the 1870s. They were one of the founding teams of the International Association, which was founded as a rival league for the National League. And I wrote about the Tecumsehs. They built the park in London here in 1877, still used for baseball. They became champions of the International Association. They had one of the first curveball pitchers of the day, Fred Goldsmith, and some pretty good other staff, other players on the roster. They won the International Association by defeating the Pittsburgh Alleghenies, which were a really good team. But they had and in the course of research there, I learned about the Pittsburgh pitcher named Pud Galvin, who a book had never been written about. So I wrote a book about the Tecumsehs, and then that sort of spawned the book about Pud Galvin, who was the fifth winningest pitcher of all time. He was the first to 300 games. He also dabbled with performance-enhancing drugs back in the 1880s, late in his career, with amazing results. And I wrote that book, and while I'm researching the Galvin book, I discovered that he played in Buffalo, and in Buffalo there was a very interesting transaction whereby the team from Detroit, which wasn't doing very well, came over and bought the big four players just after Galvin had left, and they were the big hitters of the day: Dan Bruthers, Deacon White, Hardy Richardson, and Jack Rowe. And they bought them over to Detroit. They opened their wallets, sort of like they had a guy like Steinbrenner over there named Stearns, opened his wallets, and they bought themselves a championship with the National League in 1877. And in an early version of the World Series, they defeated St. Louis, and they were on the top of the heap. The very next year, after a disappointing season and not very good fan support, they sold the team off to Cleveland, and that was the end of Detroit in the National League. Anyway, so that's that book. And so everyone sort of morphed into another one or led to another. There's sort of a linking that went on in my baseball research. That's how that happened. Sorry about the long answer.
No, that's great. That's interesting. And so that's in that journey, right? So the discovery, frankly, of, I guess, perhaps unwittingly, sort of the true birth of baseball in Detroit, which I'm sure many generations since have perhaps in an apocryphal way have probably thought it only started, it ended with the Tigers, right? So maybe we can dial it back into sort of the origins of this team, the Wolverines, and I guess, frankly, it's probably also a parallel to that of the National League itself, which was relatively new at the time of the Wolverines' existence. So maybe we could start there with sort of how you kind of began the journey and made along with the team as well in its journey.
Well, there's been some very good material written about early baseball in Michigan and in the Detroit area by Peter Morris, so that was one of my starting points. But it was very interesting that when cities like Chicago and Boston and the teams that were in the National Association, which predated the National League, when baseball was really thriving there, Detroit, there was a major debate. It was, believe it or not, it was almost a Victorian mentality there, that they didn't think it was appropriate that anyone should be paid to play baseball. And they had some early teams there, the Etnas, the Cass, and the Hunky Dory Club, and the Early Risers, and a number of them. And the head of these teams had to say, "Oh, we're sorry, we've offended people. We'll go back to playing amateur." It wasn't always that way. They sometimes hid the fact that they were playing people. So professional baseball was rather late getting into Detroit. In 1879, a fellow from Cleveland had a team in the National League, was coming to the Detroit area looking for players. And while he was in the area, his partner back in Cleveland cut him loose. This is a fellow named Hollinger. In 1879, Bill Hollinger was recruiting players. He was cut loose by his partner. So he said, well, I'm in Detroit. Detroit doesn't have a team. It's a good-sized city. Let's see if we can get a team going here. Well, he bumped into a bunch of capitalists in Detroit that were just creating something called Recreation Park, which was a horse racing venue, but also had skating rink and gymnasium and other sporting things. And the people behind what's called Recreation Park thought, gee, a ball team would be a perfect addition to this. So they encouraged Hollinger. Hollinger played his games in brand new Recreation Park, which was considered one of the most beautiful ballparks in all of North America. I think it was Harry Wright or George Wright remarked on that when they were in with Boston. It's a beautiful park, and but the problem was they were not a league team. They were an independent team, and they had to rely on arranging games with professional teams, many of whom were in their own leagues. They had to play barnstorming operations, and they went all around in Michigan looking for games. Bottom line is, it was a professional team. They didn't have enough revenue coming in, and they disbanded. I think it was by August of 1879. And so professional baseball didn't even last a full season the very first time. A couple of years later, a new mayor in Detroit, a guy named William Thompson, he said, he was well connected with some of the rich families in Recreation Park and in Detroit. He says, we should get a baseball team here. We're big enough, and I'm going to apply for it. He applied for it on letterhead of the mayor's office of the city of Detroit, and he had a little help from Spalding over in Chicago and encouragement there as well. Anyway, he applied for membership in the league on letterhead of the mayor's office and was permitted a team in Detroit. It began in 1881. Well, the mayor ran it out of his office. In fact, if you look in the Spalding guides, they say, what's the address of the team? Well, it's the mayor's office, City of Detroit. And the mayor was in office for 3 or 4 years, and finally he got a little fed up. He felt that the ball players were dishonest, that you sign a contract with them, they wouldn't keep their word, they'd play one team off another to improve their pay packet, they were carousers, drinkers, womanizers. He just got tired of dealing with them. So eventually a fellow who was a guy named Frederick Stearns, who was the head of a big pharmaceutical company in Detroit, he said, I'm going to get involved in this. We need a winner in Detroit. He'd played back at University of Michigan in the 1870s and loved baseball and said, we're going to bring a winning team to this city. Well, Fred Stearns opened his wallet, and even though the National League was clamping down on player salaries, he had all these personal service contracts with players in order to pay them above the going rate. And at one point, and this is one of the most fascinating things about the whole story of the Detroit Wolverines, Indianapolis came to Detroit trying to buy the team because it wasn't doing very well by 1884. They were, I think, last or just about last in the league. And Indianapolis was in the Western League, and that league was a little shaky, and the team had some money. And the guy who was the manager of it was a Canadian lad named Bill Watkins, came to Detroit, tried to buy the team. Well, the team didn't want to sell, and in fact, they bought Watkins, and they bought the Indianapolis franchise. First time a franchise had been bought in National League history, which caused a little consternation. Back then, when you left one team before you signed with another, there was like a 10-day grace period that, so other people could find you and maybe track you down and maybe sign you to a contract. Well, the Wolverines and Mr. Stearns and the manager said, well, we got to do something here. If we don't, do something, we're going to lose all these players. We've just bought the franchise. So they sent them on a cruise, 10 days on a body of water, and depending on who you listen to, it was either Lake Michigan, Lake St. Clair, although it was a little small, Lake Erie, or Lake Ontario. And for 10 days, the players were basically kidnapped. They were put on this ship, was not allowed to go within sight of land. They were given all the great food and drink, and they were even given cards to play and chips to play poker with. They were treated like royalty. At the end of the 10 days, the players were all brought back to Detroit by the captain, and there waiting at the dock was the manager, and he signed them all to contracts. Well, that's kind of a shocking thing to think that, kidnapping to get your players was something that you could do. Today, if you tried that, Tim, you'd be up on charges. You'd be in jail. And then they did the same thing a little later when they got the Big Four players, even though the Big Four players they wanted to play for Detroit. They were paid good money when they were lured over here because Detroit bought another franchise. They bought Buffalo. And then this time the Big Four players, they were being chased by everyone else in the National League. They, in fact, went up to a hunting lodge on Lake St. Clair that was owned by one of the directors of the Detroit club. And they hid out for 10 or 12 days in order to stay away from other teams that were trying to track them down. Ultimately, the National League said, yeah, okay, you can have them. So by hook or by crook, this guy Stearns, who was sort of like an old-time George Steinbrenner who wanted to do anything to win, basically got his way, got his players, and bought himself a championship.
Well, so this is interesting, right? Because this, and we did talk about it, a little bit of this with our previous guest in episode 33, Bill Rysick, who wrote the book Blackguards and Red Stockings, which is
yes, he's a great guy, and that's a terrific book, and was one of my research books. Yep.
Yeah, and the idea of the National Association, which obviously preceded the National League, but we did sort of get into some of the beginnings or the ramblings of or the rumblings, I should say, of I guess this sort of somewhat inelegant and incongruent evolution from more of an amateur pursuit into something approaching what I guess we would, in retrospect, look as the professionalization of the game, right? And it feels to me like some of these stories that you're talking about are some kind of rough, inelegant ways, I guess, of how maybe some of those moves towards professionalism, quote unquote.
It was a learning curve for everyone, I think, Tim.
Right, and I guess too, the maybe it's also helpful, and we'll get into Stearns and some other things in a second, but maybe it's also helpful maybe to put this in context because I get the sense, right, and I'm not an historian, I'm not a Sabre member, I just play one on television, right, but the idea of professionalism wasn't necessarily looked upon as either a wanted thing by a certain segment of the baseball populace, nor per se a positive development in certain circles. Is that correct?
Well, absolutely. And some families were so opposed to their kids, their young men going in to play professional baseball. An awful lot of them took names of somebody else in order to play the game because the families were so embarrassed that their young men that should be, in the case of Fred Goldsmith that pitched here in London, his father wanted him to go in the printing business. Now, he didn't change his name, and eventually the father, after, being estranged from him for a number of years, by the time Fred played in Chicago in the early 1880s, they finally brought his dad up from New Haven, Connecticut, introduced him on the field, and he finally accepted the fact that his son did pretty well in playing baseball, and it was a decent living. There were a number of players that, if you go back and do the research, the parents, the family was just so opposed to them getting involved in baseball. It was considered a very low-level occupation. It was too much money for just playing games. And baseball players also were great drinkers, party animals, skirt chasers, and the like. And, it was not exactly a glamorous occupation back then. Yes, they were paid more than the average working man in a number of cases. A player might be paid $2,000 a year back in the 1870s, 1880s, whereas the average working man might be making $300 a year. So it was maybe 10 times, maybe as much as 10 times more than the average worker would be earning, but it wasn't considered a very good calling by many, many people.
So so that's interesting too, because basically, I think, in other words, we're kind of dancing around this idea, really, of the beginnings of a business model around this sport. And
oh yeah, and the National League struggled to make money from baseball for the first number of years. They didn't get it right. The American Association came up in 1882, and from day one, the American Association made money. Teams like Cincinnati, they made money because they allowed play on Sundays, and they allowed the sale of alcohol, beer and alcohol, in their parks. The National League owners, it was a very small group of men, capitalists, 6 or 8, depending on which year and how many teams were in, but they just decreed that they didn't want women, they didn't want alcohol or playing on Sundays in the ballpark. They wanted women to come out. They wanted it to be a family thing. They didn't want to have degenerates and beer drinking and rowdyism and all that sort of stuff. Consequently, without Sunday play back then, people worked 6 days a week, 10 hours or 12 hours a day. The only day of rest they had was Sunday. They'd go to church, and then they'd look for something to do. The American Association realized, and in many of their cities, there are a lot of German-speaking people who like to have a beer with their recreation, and those were very profitable cities. The National League struggled and struggled and struggled for years to get any sort of profitability. That's why at the time of Detroit, and Detroit got on the wrong side of the National League, that's why at the time of Detroit they were putting a cap on salaries in order to make the business model work so that they'd have some money at the end of the day. Detroit didn't play by that game, and because Detroit didn't play by that game, the National League penalized them and changed the gate splitting arrangements so that they didn't make Detroit drew well on the road. Actually, they drew better on the road than they did at home. And so by changing the gate sharing from a third of the revenue at a park, they'd give $150, and that really was one of the reasons that led to the demise of Detroit.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, right? So before we sort of get into a little bit more specifically into the Wolverines, maybe a little bit of a tiny bit of background as to what made Detroit different by comparison to the rest, because it seems to me that as the sort of shall we say civically oriented community venture, I guess of baseball teams became more of a business model and a businessman oriented endeavor. You had a number of approaches to not only revenue, as you mentioned with the American Association, but also in terms of keeping costs down. And I think that, to me, one of the interesting things that sort of came out of my research about this is that the seeds of what we certainly saw in many, many decades down the road in labor strife with this idea of a reserve system, right? Seemed to be almost like a major tenet of this business model to keep costs in line, to keep talent within the fold, and to maybe restrict or restrain unbridled, shall we say, raiding of talent from the earliest days, back in the early 1890s, right?
Oh yeah, even earlier than that. I mean, the reserve clause came in the 1879, 1880, somewhere in there. But the National League was the first one to try to make it a business run by capitalists. The National Association and even the International Association, they had a lot of clubs that were cooperatives. Basically, they were community ventures. You split the proceeds at the end of the day and hoped you made some money, including the players. So it was something that was good for community spirit. I mean, a lot of competition, putting towns on the map, that sort of thing. And the National League was the first one that was that was run by capitalists that were trying to make money at the end of the day, make it a business, because they realized that people liked baseball. Baseball was a craze that was sort of sweeping from post-Civil War, and they felt that there's an opportunity here for us to make money. Well, they tried an awful lot of things. They tried the reserve list. They tried the cap on salaries, and the reservist list especially was one that really stuck in the craw of players. Yes, it was nice to know you'd have a job next year because you were being reserved, but it did mean you couldn't shop around your talents, okay, after your contract was over. And there were all sorts of things in there that, if you didn't play, you didn't get paid. You'd be left on tenterhooks there, not knowing if you were actually going to get a contract for the next year, but you were on a team's reserve list, so no one could talk to you. And it was tough being an employee back then. There was some glamour and that sort of stuff, and the pay wasn't too bad. But it was, I think, it was Deacon White that said, he didn't like the fact that these owners felt that they owned my carcass, and that they likened it. Some of the players likened it to slavery. And because of that hatred for the reserve clause and a lot of the practices, the limit on salaries, the brush classification system that limited salaries, that's what led to the Players' Revolt in 1890 that created the Players' League. It only lasted for 1 year, but it was a manifestation of the players feeling, well, we're being treated like slaves, we're going to start our own league.
Yeah, now to me, that's extraordinarily interesting because I think, as you look at sort of the modern day game, you think, you look back at some of the sort of more recent modern day player strikes, that this is sort of a relatively new phenomenon. It absolutely isn't. It actually was ingrained and part of the original sort of business inklings of how baseball was growing up back in the 1870s, 1880s, right?
Absolutely. No, there was a lot of dissatisfaction among the players and even among the owners. That's where Detroit got on the short end of the stick. All the other owners got teed off at Detroit for paying players large amounts of money, larger than the cap said that they should pay, and getting away with it by doing these personal service contracts so that they were paid directly by the owner under the table, in effect, and they were able to buy the best players out there and win the championships.
Well, all right, so let's talk about Detroit then. I mean, we mentioned Frederick Stearns, right, who really was the owner in the latter part of the Wolverines, 8-year existence, right? But I guess it'd be really, it's my understanding that the Wolverines, in many respects treated their players perhaps a little bit better.
They did.
Some of the other teams in the league, right? And I don't understand why that's a bad thing per se. That seems like sour grapes from some of the competitors, or was it more than that?
Well, they were treated fairly well and paid fairly well. Yes, there was a player or two that were agitators among the Wolverines that went on to get involved in the Players League. But for the most part, it was a relatively benign ownership there in terms of paying the players. There was a guy down owner in Boston named Soden, who was absolutely hated by his players. He was as tight as they come. He wouldn't spend a nickel if he could avoid it. And he was one of the guys who was among the leaders of the group that said, we have to take Detroit in hand. We have to teach them a lesson. We're going to change the way we split the gate proceeds so they're not going to profit off us when they come to town, because Detroit was a pretty good draw. They had some really good players. They had a catcher named Charlie Bennett, who should be in the Hall of Fame, who was with them the entire time. Ned Hanlon, terrific outfielder and base stealer, shares the same last name as you. And was a terrific player. They had a number of very good players who were quite happy playing in Detroit and were fairly well paid. The other teams didn't really care for the way that Detroit was running its model, because it was making it hard for them to make money in their cities. And Detroit wasn't one of the larger cities that was in the league. It was, at the time of the Wolverines, the population was like 150,000. Yes, it was bigger than places like Worcester and some of those Providence and some of the other places, but it sure was nowhere near New York or Boston or Chicago.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. Yeah, so I guess it's really important to put a push pin into this part of it, right? Because the history of Detroit, right? I think everybody sort of looks at it as, as tied intrinsically to the rise of the automobile in the early 1900s and then some. But back then, prior to the turn of the century, this city was indeed larger than sort of most hamlets in the U.S., right? But not necessarily. And you mentioned before they were a little late. Detroit was.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Cities. Yeah.
Detroit was a very different city than we see today. It was smaller. It was lots of trees. It was beautifully laid out. The road pattern was gorgeous. The fine public buildings were there. There were great Victorian buildings. It was a very good-looking city, and it was a destination of tourists when they cruised the Great Lakes. And it was actually known as the Paris of the West at the time. We're talking 1881 to 1888. Henry Ford was still, tinkering in the garage or the barn over in Dearborn. Hadn't come and transformed the city yet. It was a completely different sort of city, and it was a smaller American city among the big ones. And they wanted to sort of get a little piece of the action and get a little bit known, and they wanted to rub shoulders with the big players like Chicago and Boston, and they were determined to make their way. And in fact, because of this guy Stearns, who I liken to a sort of a George Steinbrenner type, he wanted a winner, and he did what was necessary, including kidnapping and paying more than the going rate for players, to bring a winner to Detroit, and he succeeded.
Well, before we get to Stearns, we mentioned Thompson, right? Mayor Thompson, who was instrumental in getting this franchise up and running, essentially. And look, I think for historians, right, the first ever Major League Baseball game played in Detroit was the Wolverines back in 1881, in May of 1881. You mentioned Recreation Park. But he only owned, I guess, quote unquote, the team for the first two seasons. And then before Stearns came in the latter part of the ownership of the team, you had this guy, Joseph Marsh. So maybe you can give us a sense of sort of why there were three owners in such a short period of time for this team.
Well, what happened was Thompson, the mayor, who was the first president, and he was the fellow that applied for the team and got it and then ran it out of the mayor's office. Well, by 1883, at the end of 1883, he was no longer mayor. He was getting a little bit tired of handling the team, and the team was in the bottom of the National League. It was fifth or sixth. It seemed to be going nowhere fast. He didn't seem to have a lot of drive, or I'm not sure. He may have played a bit of ball as a younger man, but he didn't have baseball in his blood. He basically retired, and a guy named Joseph Marsh, who ran a stationery company, News Depot type thing, in Detroit, took over for a while as a bit of a caretaker. On the board was this guy, Fred Stearns, who was the head of this big pharmaceutical company. He was there when Marsh was the head of it. Marsh pulled out, and I think partially because Stearns was saying, okay, enough boys, we've got to start doing things my way, and he became the real driving force and sort of, I think, nudged Marsh aside. And by 1885, he was completely in control and was in charge for the last 3-4 seasons of the team. And he's the one that helped arrange the kidnapping. He's the one that opened his personal wallet, in order to get the big players. And he wanted to bring a winner to Detroit because he'd played baseball at the University of Michigan and loved the game and knew quite a bit about it. And he hired this manager, Watkins, from the Indianapolis team, that seemed like-minded, and the two of them were a pretty effective pair. Watkins himself drew a lot of complaints from the players because he was such a strict disciplinarian. If he thought a player wasn't playing as hard as he should, he would fine them or suspend them or criticize them. And the players actually, at one point before the 1888 season began, had a little bit of a revolt and said, "We're not going to play for this guy anymore, even though we just got the National League Championship and the World Series. He's impossible to deal with. He's too hard on us." And Fred Stearns and all the directors stood behind Watkins, the manager, and the players realized, oh, well, I guess if we don't play for him, we're going to be out of work. So they sort of swallowed their pride, and they reported for work.
So, besides having played in college and sort of, I guess, a desire to win I mean, was there any other sort of motivations that you can discern that that Stearns sort of had in trying to basically, be so cavalier in trying to essentially buy / kidnap / win a championship, especially in the early days when I don't know how much financial glory there was necessarily at that time in this enterprise.
No, I think there was bragging rights, and he took over his company. Stearns Pharmaceuticals was established by his father. He was born, and his father came from Buffalo, and actually Stearns was born over in Buffalo as well. They came to Detroit, and he got into back then Detroit was big for salts and chemicals, and pharmaceuticals was a big industry. Dow Chemical isn't far out of town. Park Davis and Stearns Pharmaceuticals were the two big drug companies in Detroit, and there was a lot of competition amongst the capitalists in Detroit, and I believe he was a very competitive man in business. And in fact, I found a business guide from a little later in his career. It talked about his character and said something to the effect that when he puts his mind to something, he'll get it done regardless of the consequences. And that was the sort of driven character he was. And that's, I think, perhaps one of the reasons I sort of make the analogy to George Steinbrenner. He wanted a winner. He wanted to do things his way. He was a very strong character, and he was responsible for. He was basically the driving force, the spark plug that took them to the next level.
Well, you mentioned a few of these sort of kidnapping incidents and stuff. So, so I have these sort of notes here that sort of tell me that you mentioned Indianapolis, but he also essentially purchased, quote unquote, essentially the entire Buffalo Bisons franchise as well.
Yes. They the same year, 1885. First of all, they bought the Indianapolis franchise, including the manager and all the players, and that's when they had to do the kidnapping because never before had the same team own two teams, right? And there were strict rules about when players are let go by one team and are hired by another, and that was that 10-day period that people could be shopping around looking for some place to go. This is before the reserve clause, of course. And then later that year, that same season, they bought the entire Buffalo franchise. Buffalo was really struggling. They were they had a brand new park, and they were having trouble getting more than a couple of hundred fans out to the park. They first of all sold off Bud Galvin, the pitcher, their star pitcher, over to Pittsburgh. And then they basically let it be known that the franchise was up for sale. Not just, don't come in and cherry pick the players. You come in, you want to buy this team, you buy the entire team, you get it all. So by later in the season of 1885, Buffalo was purchased by Detroit. Fred Stearns became one of the directors of what was the left of the Buffalo club and sort of represented it at the National League. And they brought the big four players because that's who they wanted. They didn't want the entire franchise, but they wanted the big four players, and they paid a premium price. Brought them to Detroit, had them suited up for a game in Recreation Park. They were going to play them one September, I think it was September 19th game against New York, I think it was. And they were all suited up, ready to go. And Nick Young, the president of the National League, wired to the umpire and said, if those players, they put them on the field, forfeit the game and tell them so. The National League, because they were still struggling with this idea of two franchises, not having happened before, they said, no, you cannot acquire all those players and then play them until we give the okay. They didn't get the okay until November after the season was over. In the meantime, Detroit said, okay, discretion's the better part of valor. We'll just let them sit out for the rest of the season. We had planned to use them, but if the National League is going to cause us grief, okay, we'll just let them decide. And they decided that they could keep the team. So the Big Four batters didn't actually play for Detroit until the 1886 season and made an immediate impact. Actually, so much so that they came second to Chicago in the National League that year after being sixth or seventh.
All right, so let's talk about those big four, right? Two of them are now enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but do you want to give a little bit of background into why, who and why this big four, why they were so important and or significant as was proven in 86 and certainly in 1887 when the bigger things happened?
Well, they just had very good bats. I mean, Hardy Richardson, Deacon White, Jack Rowe, and
Dan Brothers.
And Bruthers, and Dan Bruthers, yeah.
Excuse me.
These guys, yeah, Bruthers is how it's pronounced. These guys were the class of the league. They were always in the top the batting averages. They had terrific bats, and pitchers would fear them. They played together in Buffalo for a while, and then they were bought lock, stock, and barrel to Detroit, and they made a big difference. Now, Deacon White has just recently been put in the Hall of Fame. Trying to think. There's three of the four are in the Hall of Fame now.
My notes have Deacon White and Dan Bruthers are in the Hall of Fame. Rowe and Richardson are not.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Not as of yet. Yeah. I think you're quite right. It's been a while since I wrote this. Sometimes the details get a little foggy, but yeah, they were terrific. They were sought after. When they came back from that hunting lodge that they were hidden away at up on Lake St. Clair, they came back to their hotels, and they had all these offers from other teams that were waiting for them, and managers were skulking around Detroit from other teams trying to find the Big Four, going to the hotel, going to the ballpark, trying to find them because they wanted to talk them into playing for them. They were very much in demand. They were stars. I mean, the Big Four. They were just known as the Big Four back then because they had four big men. I mean, they were significant men in terms of size. Not so much Jack Rowe and not so much Deacon White, but Dan Bruthers was a huge man, over 6 feet tall, and these guys could just clout the ball. And then there was Sam Thompson, who came from Indianapolis, who was also a great bat. So they had a murderer's row of batters back then, and it was a pretty impressive group.
Well, it's also some interesting personalities here too. So in my crack research, I determined or found out that Mr. White, James Laurie Deacon White. I'm not sure why he was nicknamed Deacon. Maybe you.
Oh, he was nicknamed Deacon because he was church going. He didn't swear. He didn't drink. He was a pillar. Another fellow on the team, another pitcher named Lady Baldwin, was called Lady because of the same reason. He had very gentle manners. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He didn't carry on. Back then, they used these names. I mean, there was a guy named Hoy that couldn't speak. They called him Dummy Hoy. I mean, these people just threw around nicknames for everybody at one point. And it's funny, too, because the Detroit team was full of people with nicknames. Pretzels Getzine was a pitcher. Stump Weedman was a pitcher. You had Lady, you had Deacon, you had all these names. It's part of the culture of the ball teams way back then. Everybody seemed to have a nickname.
All right, let our completists note that Pretzels Getzine. That's our first Pretzels Getzine reference on here on the show, and it only took us about 49, 50 episodes to get to that. Just that name alone is worthwhile pursuing its own show, I think, and I will absolutely make a note to do that. But
Pretzels, you know how Pretzels got his name?
I have no idea. I don't know who the guy was. Go ahead.
Okay, well, it was said he was one of the top pitchers for Detroit. Pretzels Getzine. He was actually born, I think, in Germany, and Getzine was an anglicization of a German name, and it's I-E-N, not E-I-N at the end. G-E-T-Z, you say, I-E-N. He they called him Pretzels because he could turn pitchers into pretzels, trying to connect with the ball. He had so much stuff on the ball. The batters would sort of turn themselves inside out or into pretzels in order to try to connect with the ball.
I love this. This is great. Pretzels. I love it. Okay, now we have to make a note to see if we can find some photos of the great Pretzels in action. But
you could probably do a piece just on great nicknames. I mean, Lady, Deacon, Pretzels, Stump. Oh, there's Fatty. Fatty Bridie was the catcher. I mean, Fatty. Could you imagine today calling a player by a descriptive name? You know, Baldy or Fatty or Ugly.
That's hilarious. Well, the one thing that stuck out for me, besides White's nickname, and see if I have this right, according to some historical accounts, White believed that the Earth was flat. And apparently he was he tried very hard to convince his teammates that we were living on a flat plane and not in a globe structure. And apparently they ridiculed him for that. But you got to imagine what the clubhouse was like during this time when, hey, you got some downtime, maybe you're waiting on a rain delay or something, or you're traveling between teams, between the cities, and Hey, what's going on, Deacon? Well, I don't know. This is taking a long time. You know why? Because the world is flat.
That's right.
Can't imagine.
That's right.
Can't imagine what these conversations were like.
Well, he was very, very religious, hence the name deacon. It may have been part of his religious belief, system that the world was flat. I mean, science be damned. I mean, that was him. I mean, there's all sorts of characters in ball. I mean, there was in Allegheny, my previous book, there was a monkey, a good luck monkey, apparently, that supposedly hung around one of the players. And apparently, at one point, he was considered such good luck, but apparently the monkey died, and the players got into a little bit of monkey business and actually made sure they buried him near home plate at the home park in order to keep the good luck going. I mean, there's all sorts of great stories about the early days of baseball. Real characters of the players, weird belief systems, weird practices. If I can share a little anecdote with you.
Please.
In my research, I kept coming across this term for a number of players like Bruthers or Bennett or Baldwin or some of these players. You'd be seeing something about the player is going to be off for a couple of weeks. They have malaria. And I go, malaria? Well, Detroit is on the Detroit River. It's a northern river. It's not swampy. It's not a lot of malaria that I'm aware of. I live 2 hours away from Detroit myself, and I don't remember any malaria up in this part. And then I thought, well, they did have spring training. One of their first managers, Frank Bancroft, or their very first manager, Frank Bancroft, pioneered spring training in the South and took them down to New Orleans. And so I think, well, I wonder if maybe they were picking up malaria in New Orleans. And I kept seeing this. These players, they're off, and they were sending them up to Mount Clemens because there were some spa and baths up there. And thinking, I don't know how that cures malaria. But at any rate, so I'm really puzzled. I go to Cooperstown for the 19th century baseball conference that I presented at last year, actually. And I took a couple of the guys aside. David Nemec, who's a great researcher, has written a number of books. And I said, David, I keep running into this thing while I'm researching Detroit about all these players from Detroit are coming down with malaria. Do you have any idea what that's all about? And he says, no, I didn't really run into that very much. So then a little bit later, John Thorne, who is the Major League Baseball historian and who's written extensively, and he's like, he's like Moses for baseball. He's awesome. And I said to him, John, I keep running into this thing and these players that are coming down with malaria. I had barely got the word malaria out of my mouth, and he says, it's the clap. Baseball players were very popular with the ladies, and they would travel extensively, and they would come down with social diseases, it turns out. And this was one of the things that the managers of the day had to deal with when their players were indisposed. I still don't know, however, how going to a spa and baths for a couple of weeks would cure you of a sexually transmitted disease, but apparently that's what they were doing.
Wow, that's okay. So was this unique to baseball players of the time? Was this just simply a microcosm of maledom back in the day generally amongst the populace? What's your sense of?
I think it was baseball players, because here you are, you're paid a lot of money, and you're on the road a lot, and you're in all these cities, and you're staying at all these decent hotels, and the players, for instance, when Detroit was coming to town, some of the newspapers in other cities would say, "Oh, Charlie Bennett and the Detroit Wolverines are coming to town, ladies. You'll find that interesting on Saturday," or whatever, right? The players were big, tall, handsome. Many of them were tall, handsome, and strapping guys. And, they'd look for something to do. Many of them were drinkers and party animals, and the young ladies would come to the ballpark, and, one thing would lead to another. In London here, for instance, we had Fred Goldsmith, the pitcher, and his catcher was Phil Powers. Both good-looking American guys came up here to play ball and were paid a lot of money. Both of them married London girls while they were here. Sometimes it would lead to romance and spouses, and sometimes it would lead to something like malaria.
Quote unquote. That's very interesting. So, let's maybe start getting into the 1887 season, because this was obviously a very pivotal and remarkable season for the Wolverines franchise. In that, all of that talent whether purchased or hijacked or kidnapped or otherwise somehow found, led to, I guess, the ultimate in success, being both the National League pennant, which at the time really was the only professional league, but also this quote unquote World Series title in 1887. Maybe you can.
Actually, the National League was challenged from the American Association existed from 1882 to 1892. So in 1886, 1887, there were two leagues, and I think it was 84. They had the first of the World Series. But getting back to the 1887 season, Detroit had such a powerful lineup, and everyone thought that they were going with the Big Four and Sam Thompson and Charlie Bennett and some of the pitching staff they had. Early on, the thinking was this is going to be the class of the league. And sure enough, in May, they got in first place, and they never relinquished first place for the rest of the season. They absolutely hammered everyone else. And like the previous years, it was agreed to make additional money at the end of the season. The American Association champion would play the National League champion. And Chris Vonderhaugh, who was the head of the St. Louis Browns, who had been in the World Series the previous year and also won the American Association in 1887, he and Fred Stearns from Detroit got together and said, okay, let's play a series. We'll call it the World Series, and we want to milk it for everything it's worth. What they came up with was this plan to play 15 games and play them in a variety of cities. Only a couple of games would be played in each of St. Louis and Detroit, and they would take the thing on the road, and they'd go Boston, New York, and all over the place in order to make money. And to make sure they made lots of money, they said it's going to be a 15-game series, and we're going to play all 15 games. Well, that meant that the series went rather late, and by the 10th game or 11th game, Detroit had it wrapped up, but they had to keep playing later and later in the season. And very late in the season, I believe, if I recall correctly, the last game, I can't remember if it was in St. Louis or somewhere, but they had 600 shivering fans to watch the final game, which probably barely paid for their expenses once you figured the travel and the salaries and that sort of thing. But a 15-game World Series, it's the early primitive version of the World Series. It started, I think, in 84, and it went to about 1887 or 8, somewhere in there. And it was the predecessor of the World Series between the National League and the American League that began in 1903.
Yeah, and I guess that was my comment earlier. Is I not to denigrate the American Association at the time. And again, I'm not a professional historian, so please note that asterisk. But
no problem.
But the idea that this idea of the World Series is still, I think, when looked upon backwards in historical framework, it was not sort of was now known as the modern day World Series, right? So it seems to me like.
Sure.
Would it be fair or charitable to call it an exhibition series, or was it kind of truly a quote unquote championship, or is it somewhere in between?
Oh no, there was a lot of bragging rights attached to it, and there was a trophy attached to it, and there's a pennant attached to it. No, they took it seriously. I mean, it was a clear cut, money raising thing. Of course, I suppose you could argue that once the more modern World Series started, it's a money making thing too. But they called it also, instead of just the World Series back in the 1880s, they also called it the World Championship as well. So it wasn't known as World Series, capital W, capital S, the World Series that we know of today. And obviously when you're running it to 15 games and there's only 600 people at the tail end, no, these were serious games, and they earned money for it, and they were trying to get as many fans out as possible, and there were significant bragging rights attached to who prevailed at the end of the day.
Well, all right, having reached then the pinnacle of what was called a World Championship team, and certainly winning their league as well, the National League, you'd think that the team would have been, at least again on my basic cursory research, would have been primed for ongoing success. But of course, that was not to be the case, right? Because the following season was their last one. Maybe you can give us some
Okay.
sort of, understanding of why that was the case. And maybe I'm sure economics and other things had a role to play, and the other teams in the league not being happy with the way Detroit was running their shop.
Yeah, that's all part of the mix. It's a little complicated. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. The 1888 season, here they are, the reigning champions, and one would think things are on the roll and things are great. They didn't draw very many fans to the ballpark in Detroit. They were still a draw on the road, but Detroit, for some reason, the Detroit fans just really weren't there in significant numbers, and they never really had been. And I put that down to the fact that they were in the wrong league. Had they been in the American Association, they could have had Sunday games, and they could have had alcohol in the ballpark. I mean, Detroit was an early city to industrialize, and so a lot of people the only time they'd have away from the work floor and would be on Sunday. So the crowds I think it was a bad fit. They were in the wrong league, for starters. Secondly, the punitive gate-sharing arrangements that the other owners had put on Detroit also hurt their bottom line, because they were getting most of their money from the road trips. They were big draws. They were getting significant crowds, 20,000 or something like that in some of the big cities. And Chicago was always a big draw. Even when Chicago came to Detroit, it was their best crowds. So there was a real good rivalry between Detroit and Chicago. And it was Chicago, Spalding over in Chicago, that decided that I'm not going to penalize them with the $150 gate. I'm going to let them continue to get 30% when they come and visit us. So it was Spalding that helped Detroit get through and was a big friend at the end. I think he may have been worried that they might jump to the American Association, and at one point, when they were being threatened by the other owners, the Detroit had threatened themselves to jump to the other league. At any rate, the fans weren't there. The money wasn't there. There was a lot of dissension on the team. The team was really fighting with the manager. The manager was fighting with the team. He gave Pretzel's Getzine. He fined him $100, which was a lot of money back then, for back talk. Talking back to the manager. When he didn't think somebody legged it out hard enough to get to the next base, he'd fine them $100. He was becoming quite disliked by the players, and the injuries, there were a number of injuries. The team was not doing very well. Partway through the season, the manager says, okay, I'm out of here. I can't take this anymore. And at the end of the season, I think they finished fourth or something. I don't have it right handy, but they didn't do all that well for the reigning champions. And at the end of the season, the directors, Fred Stearns and his buddies, Fred had to take over his father's business right around then and was going to become very, very, very busy with the pharmaceutical business. So he decided, well, I'm going to have to pull out, and I guess the directors all got together, quite disappointed that they didn't get greater support in Detroit from the fans, and the directors got together and said, let's sell. They sold the franchise to Cleveland, and the players scattered to the winds, and Detroit was without a professional team for several years. It wasn't until 1894 that a guy named George Vanderbeck came along and put a team in the Western League, and he called it the Creams. They were going to be the cream of the league. He called them the Creams, and not long afterwards they changed the name to the Tigers, and not long after that the Western League became the American League, and eventually Detroit was a founding member of the American League and has been in the American League ever since. I think a lot of people associate Detroit as an American League team, American League city, and it wasn't always that way.
Why do you think it took that long of a period of time between the demise of the Wolverines and the arrival of the Tigers? Was it indeed the growth and the then sort of booming industrialization, courtesy of the auto industry, the budding auto industry, that made Detroit a more, shall we say, viable city because of its rapid growth at that point later? Well, by 1893-94, Detroit really wasn't buzzing as an auto city. It was just the early days of it. Things were just starting to get going. It wasn't really humming until as an auto city until after the turn of the century, and even by 1905 or 1910, I think there was a reluctance, given what had happened with the Wolverines, and seeing that they couldn't draw that well. I think there was a reluctance to go back into the National League. There was an attempt. Both Buffalo and Detroit tried to get back into the league in about 1891 or somewhere in there. And the National League owners said nope. They weren't a stayer, as they said. They weren't there for the long haul, so we don't want them back, either of them.
I think that after a number of years, though, without a professional team, Detroit said, well, let's give it a shot. Let's have a go again. And that's where the Western League and the beginnings of the Tigers came from.
So in your research, is there any sort of misunderstood or not appreciated legacy that the Wolverines sort of brought to bear during their brief existence in the late 1800s, or were they just more symptomatic or emblematic, I guess, of a wild and woolly maturation process of the move towards the professionalism of baseball generally?
Yeah, they were a team playing professional league baseball at a time that the National League was still trying to get it right about how to run teams, how to make money. The rules were changing. I mean, the Detroit. Until 1884, you had to throw underhand. You couldn't throw overhand. And it wasn't until 1894 that the 60-foot 6-inch pitching distance was brought in. So it was the game itself was being modified on an almost annual basis. At one point, you had to have 7 or 8 balls to have a walk and 4 strikes for an out. Even early on, and just before Detroit started playing, you used to be able to catch it on the first bounce and still call it an out. So the game was evolving as a game. The business model was certainly evolving. Detroit was, from 1881 to 1888, when they existed, the Wolverines, they straddled a couple of interesting eras in baseball when it was going from a sort of a primitive game to a more business-like venture, and the rules were being refined. Stolen bases weren't counted until 1885, for instance. There were all sorts of little tweaks that were going on in the game. So if you want to know about an interesting time in baseball history, I think the story of the Detroit Wolverines sort of captures it.
That's very interesting. And I also think, too, we talked about Pretzel's Get Signed again. I'm going to go back to him because it almost feels to me that, you could, besides going into nicknames and stuff of just not only the players of the Wolverines, but of other league players at that time, it seems to me that Getzheim was also kind of, I don't know if he was the inventor of the curveball, but he certainly was, recognized as almost an innovator and maybe even a popularizer of the curveball pitch way back when.
Well, he was a little later. Fred Goldsmith, who pitched here in 1874 to 1878, he claimed to have invented the curveball, and he threw it with great effectiveness. He was one of the reasons the team here was so successful. But there's a guy named Candy Cummings who pitched even earlier, and he didn't pitch as long. He claimed to have invented it and learned it down at Harvard or Yale or wherever it was. And in fact, he is in the Baseball Hall of Fame partly on the basis of his claim that he invented the curveball. He was also one of the founders of the International Association in 1877. So they predate, both Goldsmith and Cummings predate Pretzel's. There were a number of pitchers throwing curves by the time that Pretzel was. He just was able to something mystifying about his delivery. For instance, Pud Galvin, same thing. He had a wicked fastball, not much of a curve because he had a very small hand, but he just was effective in mixing stuff up and confusing the batters. So Pretzel's was just a wily practitioner who was quite effective, but he had a number of pitches that he threw. But no, the early curve ballers predated him by a little bit.
Interesting. Very interesting. All right, so how about some promotional opportunity here? Tell us where we can find the book, and I'm also curious to see if you've got any other ideas in mind for future work books.
Oh, I'm working on a beauty right now. I just put down my paperwork from the one I'm just starting. But let's talk about the Detroit Wolverines, the rise and wreck of the National League team, 1881 to 1888 is the title of the book. If you just Google Detroit Wolverines, you could find it. But just Google it, and it's widely available all over Amazon, everything. It's ebook as well. The publisher is McFarland, but just Google it and you can find it. It's everywhere out there. I think we're selling a few copies. I made a presentation at the Sabre Group in Detroit last week, and they gobbled up every copy I had. And I think it's doing fairly well. It's one of my favorite books. I've written 8 altogether. And it's just a great story of interesting characters, interesting time in Detroit, and I've learned a lot about Detroit. And I just took a friend down there to show him the plaque where Recreation Park used to be. It's at the Detroit Medical Center, and all that's left is just a plaque saying this is where right field or left field used to be in Recreation Park days. And it's just a wonderful story as far as I'm concerned. As far as projects I'm working on, well, you might find this of interest, and maybe we can talk about this at a future time. I'm writing about the Canadian who taught Babe Ruth how to play baseball.
Again, with the Canadians with the baseball history. Look at you.
Well, I'm up here. You guys gotta know that it's not just Americans that play the game. It's your national pastime, but we've been playing it an awful long time too. Brother Matthias was the big Zavarian brother at St. Mary's Industrial Training School in Baltimore, where Babe Ruth was sent as an incorrigible 7-year-old boy. And Babe Ruth Brother Matthias took Babe Ruth under his arm and taught him how to play, how to catch, how to pitch. He was the greatest man I ever met. He taught me how to play baseball. Babe Ruth said in later life he gave him not one, but 2 Cadillacs as thank yous. Brother Matthias, his real name was Martin Leo Boutillier, and he was born in Cape Breton Island in 1872. And he moved later to Boston and ultimately to Baltimore. So, Canadians get a kick out of little things like we can tell you guys about.
Yet again, we as American citizens owe a debt of gratitude to our neighbors to the north, and perhaps more interestingly, as maybe the seeds of the foundation of our actual national pastime. Can you imagine? Chip, this has been awesome. I appreciate this. I wouldn't even call it a stroll down nostalgia lane, because this is obviously predates both of us. But it's history, right? And the history of pro sports is what we're, especially those teams and leagues that don't exist anymore. That's why we're here for whatever reason. But that it doesn't mean that hasn't been in our collective memories. But without teams like the Wolverines and the various characters, and look, we even talked about some things like the reserve clause, and these things actually are a lot of these kids today, right? They think everything is new, but the reality is that some of these issues and some of these developments and processes and people obviously were much earlier in history, and that's why we try to unearth some of these stories. And I appreciate your helping us through the Wolverines one.
History is a lot of fun. Baseball history is a heck of a lot of fun. And just learning about a time when things were different and the game was different and people were different and cities were different, I get a real kick out of that. It turns my crank, and it sounds like it does the same with you, Tim.
All right, interesting stuff from Chip. Thanks, Chip, for being part of our little showgram here. And everything old is new again, or everything new is, frankly, not new. It's a lot of these things are rooted in the past. And that's kind of why we explore some of these things. I mean, the origins of the reserve clause and the challenges to that, and the players sort of uniting to fight back on that stuff. The Wolverines were a part of that mix. This guy Fred Stearns, right, the last owner of the Wolverines, right? He basically was the George Steinbrenner of his time. Interesting to know that the roguishness of the adult male, especially in the sporting world, was not necessarily new or a modern scenario. It certainly was quite the thing back in the late 1800s, especially as a number of them came down with, quote unquote, malaria once in a while. I mean, what else? Some of these nicknames, my gosh, I agree with Chip. We might want to actually do an episode specifically focused on the wackiest nicknames, perhaps of certain eras. And again, if there isn't one now, perhaps we'll start one, and a fan club for the great Pretzels Getzine, who we might make some fun because of the name, but he was quite a prolific pitcher. He of the curveball extraordinaire, and depending on who you talk to and the legends attached to, was apparently a guy who could actually make the ball curve twice, hence sort of the pretzel sort of reference to his nickname. But the Detroit Wolverines, very interesting story. And again, the book is called The Detroit Wolverines, The Rise and Wreck of a National League Champion. It is published by our friends at McFarland. You can get it, as they say, wherever good books are found. And of course, you can find a link to it, and a great way to support the show by clicking and buying through that link in our episode 50 on our website, and that's at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And of course, that is also where you're going to find all the latest information about this little show, all the past episodes, all the past media and books and videos and all kinds of things that we mentioned and feature during our little escapades here. It's also where you'll be able to find where our social media links are and all the various feeds and where our players are. You can listen to and download and RSS and whatever you want to do to find our show. And again, on social media, please do follow us early and often. We love it when you do that, and we'd love to connect with you in those environments. Of course, at Twitter, that's at Good Seats Still. Again, at Good Seats Still on Twitter. You'll find us, of course, on Instagram, and that's Good Seats Still Available. And you'll find a Facebook page devoted to us as well. You can comment to us there. If you'd like to send us some email, make sure you go to our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find a link to our email address there. And again, can't underline this enough. Please, 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 by all means, when you get a chance, rate, review us wherever you can, especially in Apple iTunes / Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called these days. We get heat, and the algorithms get all nice and warm for us when you put some good karma, some good comments into those places too. So, and again, we love how you discover our show. Please let us know how you find the show, how you listen to the show, what you like, what you don't like. And of course, if you do like, please tell some friends, and we'd love to get more and more listeners as we continue to get larger and more robust as we near almost now, believe it or not, a whole year's worth of episodes on this little show. We can't do that and without you. We thank you. You know who you are. And please indeed keep listening, and lots more fun stuff. Appreciate all your suggestions. We will get to all of them, and there's some more fun stuff ahead as the weeks and months play out. So thanks again for listening, and until next week, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.